Hey everybody! Today I will be gutting this cheap watercolor tin and replacing the contents with something a little more fancy. I have 3 different watercolors, one being very cheap, the second being reasonably priced for a beginner, and the third being top quality tube paints. And we will be comparing these watercolors to see if the quality really justifies the price difference. Here I am removing the pre-existing watercolor cakes, and I'll be using these a little bit later as my super cheap watercolors. I washed the plastic so it's nice and clean, and after I dried it, I started adding my May Mary Blue watercolors. These watercolors are very nice quality, and they came from the Catherine Anderson series. They retail for $111. I actually didn't spend that much money on these though. My mom picked them up from a garage sale for a fraction of the price. The last 2 pans I included Winsor & Newton Ivory Black, and then just a white from a Reeves set. So now comes the fun part, comparing. For the super cheap paints, I'm using the watercolor cakes I removed from the tin earlier, and for the reasonably priced paints, I'm using Reeves student grade watercolor paints. For the nice expensive ones, I'm using the May Mary Blue watercolors. I decided to choose 3 primary colors to swatch. I chose a warmer red, a cool yellow, and a cool blue. My first impression with these cheap watercolor cakes was that they did not like to bleed or blend. They just sort of sat there on the paper waiting for me to push them around. They also took a bit of effort to activate with the water and appeared less pigmented and chalky. Now I'm using the Reeves watercolors, and I used to use these paints all of the time when I first started out. And from experience, I can tell you that they're definitely a good choice if you're on a budget. And now for the expensive ones. You can already tell that the moment my brush hits the water, that pigment is transferred much easier. It flows through the water and blends much smoother. These expensive paints are even more pigmented and rich. For my second test, I decided to blend the paints together to get some secondary colors. Like earlier, the paints got easier to blend and bleed as the quality went up. If you need a video to watch about mixing watercolor paints, by the way, I recommend Macocino's video called How to Avoid Muddy Colors When Painting, and it explains warm colors and cool colors and which ones you should mix in order to get nice, vibrant, beautiful secondary colors. And now that we see the quality difference between the paints, let's try painting a picture to see how these work when you're actually making a painting. I'm starting off with the cheapest watercolors first, and they definitely were a challenge to lay down. Getting the bleeding effect in the sky was really difficult. I kind of had to work at it, and it didn't have the best pigmentation. The little cakes took a lot of effort to get the color out, and the transparency of these paints seems to be a tad cloudy, which gives it that chalky quality. My next watercolors are the Reeves student grade watercolors. So this was interesting. I felt like I struggled using these paints more than the previous cheaper paints. They were somewhat gritty and the paint was really difficult to blend. They were less chalky than the previous ones, but it seemed harder to get a nice smooth effect with them. I haven't used these paints in a while, and now I remember why I stopped using them. They get the job done, but you have to work for it. And now for the nice expensive paints. Honestly, I absolutely love these paints. They're so pigmented, they're smooth, and they blend so easily. I mean, just look at that sky. I barely had to put any effort into it to get it to that nice wispy cloud effect. You really only need a tiny amount of paint to cover a good amount of space on the page, which means that the paints will last someone a lot longer than the cheaper quality paints. They also have great light fastness, which means that they'll fade much more slowly over time. Now that I'm an adult and I have a job and I can buy myself watercolor supplies, I definitely think that the May Mary Blue watercolors are the best for their price. They're expensive, but they're definitely worth it. Winsor & Newton is also another good brand. they're a little bit more reasonably priced, but those ones are nice in quality too. For kids, students, beginners, and people who want to just give watercolors a try, I would recommend the Reeves watercolors. They're a good way to learn the basics and get a feeling for the medium. And if you want a challenge, you can try watercolor cakes. You could try like Crayola or something similar to this, something from the dollar store, and you can really try to see how well you know your watercolor. Anyway, that's about it. Thanks for watching this week's video, and I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!